So yeah, let's
Yes,
get started.
absolutely. All right. Well, I'm going to kick us off. My name is Dr. Sarah Thompson Tweedy, and I'm the president here at Big Bend Community College, for those of you who may not know me. And I want to thank you all for joining us for the inaugural Passion Project Showcase. The students, faculty, and staff of Big Bend Community College are amazing people who do phenomenal things. And that is why the Passion Project Showcase was born. The purpose of the showcase is to feature the works of wonder from members of our community. Now, this is a new venture and one we hope to continue on a quarterly basis. And in order for this venture to be successful, we need to bring attention to the talents and passions that exist among us. Now, to be clear, the Passion Project Showcase is not exclusively for academic interests or expertise. What we're interested in is building community by emphasizing the amazing talents of our members, their contributions they make to ours and the broader community. So if you have a passion project that you wish to share, don't be afraid to toot your own horn, okay? Alternatively, if you know someone who amazes and dazzles you with one of their talents or their expertise, call them out with their permission, of course, so that we can highlight them at one of our future showcases. So tonight, our first showcase highlights the passion project of Dr. Allison Palumbo, who wrote Love and the Fighting Female, a critical study of on-screen depictions. And I am so proud that Dr. Palumbo serves among us as a tenured English faculty member. They have a PhD in English from the University of Kentucky and a long list of literary loves. Dr. P's research and teaching emphasize gender issues in American literature and popular culture. In addition to their work on the sexual politics of romance as portrayed on screen, they have published articles on Henry Miller's Tropics trilogy. Beyond their passion for guessing entire movie plot lines in the first 5 minutes, I want to see that, Dr. P. They love to read heavy books on hot beaches, indulge in good food, and take road trips. So Dr. Palumbo will begin by reading an excerpt from their book and will be followed by questions from the panel. And later we will provide opportunities for questions from the audience using the Q&A feature as Tiffany described. So if you have a question, click on the Q&A toward the bottom of the Zoom frame and place your question there, and we'll raise those questions a little later in the program. But without further ado, Dr. Palumbo, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here and part of the inaugural Passion Project Showcase. And I work with such an amazing group of people here at Big Bend. The people you see here working with me on this now are just a fraction of the really awesome people here on campus. And I'm excited to get other people involved, other faculty members and staff and students as we continue this over the years. So this is my first book, and I'm going to be starting by reading some excerpts from the introduction. I'm going to skip a paragraph here or there if you're following along, just to keep this from being too long of a reading. I think that if we were all in person, it would be a little bit different, but listening to a person just read at you on screen for 20 minutes or more could probably get a little difficult. I don't know if you have your wine ready or your popcorn or however you like to enjoy your evening, but I just want to kind of give you a sense of why I did this project. And that's really captured in my introduction and my passion for understanding more about the sexual politics of our lives. And because I'm a pop culture nut, it really made sense to do it with film and television. So I'm going to start here with my introduction. Like many children in the 1970s, I worshipped superheroes. One of my favorite childhood pictures shows me standing next to my older brother as we wear matching Superman Halloween costumes. But the first hero to capture my attention was Wonder Woman. Accessories as weapons, a fun costume, superpowers. What more could a child ask of their favorite hero? First, I had the underoos, and then I had the makeshift costume with sweatbands for bracelets and a jump rope lasso. I wanted to fight for good as Wonder Woman did. I wanted to do things that no other human could do. And because of her, I thought both were possible. As one who was raised as a female in a time where roles for women on screen allowed for little room for heroism, Wonder Woman provided a unique inspiration for me. The 2017 reboot on the big screen only further reinforced this perception for me as I watched Diana Prince fight once again to save the world while totally owning the DC comic film world, as Captain Marvel arguably did for the Marvel film franchise 2 years later. And for those of you who want to argue about this, I would be happy to do that. But more than just an inspiration, characters like Captain Marvel and Wonder Woman are examples of what I will henceforth refer to as the strong, independent woman archetype, which is exemplified by an empowered female identified character whose behavior stands in striking contrast to dominant historical views of women as the weaker sex, both mentally and physically. Maternal instincts, nurturing capacities, domestic abilities, and moral integrity have all been considered important traits in womanhood within the past 2 centuries. These traits not only set women apart from men, but it also gave them an important platform for asserting their worth, for education, for political franchise, for economic independence, etc. But physical force and vigor, aggression, and the exuberant exercise of power, pleasure in competition and defiance, competent authority, and autonomy have been largely absent from cultural notions of women's strengths. The archetype of the strong, independent woman arises precisely in response to that absence. I'm going to skip to the next paragraph. Today, there are more examples of the strong, independent woman archetype in America than ever in America, not only as fictional characters, but as real women. Women running Fortune 500 companies, acting as whistleblowers and participating in combat, reigning on billboards in prime time, crushing Olympic records and dominating championships, and winning the popular vote for president. In the 2020 election, several women vied for the Democratic Party nomination for president, more than had ever run at the same time. These women are role models whose presence in popular culture makes the concept of empowered women seem like a norm for Americans. They also show us that being tough, autonomous, intelligent, aggressive, and rational no longer means being a man. In fact, those traits don't even mean being masculine, at least not in the sense of being incompatible with or the opposite of feminine. Strength and independence are now part of what many women learn through mass media about being a woman in narrative after narrative. At least it's what I learned as I continued to watch strong, independent female characters on screen. I sought them throughout my childhood in my Saturday cartoons, religiously waking myself up at 5:30 in the morning so I could watch the latest exploits of Jem and She-Ra, or the kick-ass Scarlet and Lady J keeping up with the boys on G.I. Joe. My favorite game for pretend was to play spy, creating an amalgam of whatever James Bond woman happened to be popular at the time, though Grace Jones was always my favorite, and Bond too, because I wanted to run the show. One of my dreams was to be Joan Wilder from Romancing the Stone and the Jewel of the Nile. She had exciting international exploits, found love, faced death, and she used it all as fodder for another best-selling novel. To me, Joan combined the most interesting aspects of some of my favorite stories: heroic adventures, important careers, and romance. For at the same time I sought stories of kick-ass ladies, I sought stories of love for characters that achieved success in their careers. I watched movies like When Harry Met Sally and Baby Boom over and over. I was devoted to television characters like Laura Holt, Maddie Hayes, and Claire Huxtable, model career women who followed their dreams and their hearts on the burgeoning path to having it all. By my early 20s, I was still devoted to heroic women's stories, but the love narratives had started to lose some of their appeal. The release of a new Meg Ryan, Tom Hanks vehicle seemed far less interesting to me than the latest installment of the Alien franchise. Now, had I lost interest in romance? Far from it. In fact, this was at the time in my life when I was very serious about finding a great love. However, I was also struggling to be my own person, to understand my identity, to follow my dreams, and to start down my chosen career path. I had plans to travel the world and to attend graduate school. I was coming into and exercising my own forms of strength and independence. But I was tired of the one-sided representations of male-identified characters doing this, of feeling that only one version of this kind of empowerment existed. I wanted balance and social justice. I wanted to see more evidence of women on screen doing the same, women making a difference, doing something amazing, and being the heroes of their own stories, their own lives and stories. Unfortunately, there weren't very many female-bodied characters who did that, who also got to find love. In fact, the more romance a woman enjoyed in a narrative, the less strength or independence of any kind she expressed in the story, especially before the last 2 decades. An example is You've Got Mail, the quaint story about finding romance in unexpected circumstances with an unexpected person, as a fierce business competition leads to love. Meg Ryan's character Kathleen starts out as an independent business owner, but by the end of the story, she's lost her business. Furthermore, she loses it to the man she ends up loving. You've Got Mail tells us that gaining love is enough for a woman to make up for losing a career, a legacy. How depressing is that? Trade-offs for women are typical in romance narratives. Another Meg Ryan character, Kate from French Kiss, gives up her citizenship, a teaching job, and all of her hard-earned savings to a man with questionable ethics and a surly demeanor in exchange for his eventual devotion and life on a vineyard in a country where she doesn't even speak the language. If women on screen aren't giving something up for love, then their obsession with and neuroses about love define them more than their career ambitions, like Bridget Jones, who does have success at work, but it always seems like an accident. Or the female characters rely on love to save them in some way, as in Pretty Woman or its lesser counterpart, Milk Money, in which a female prostitute with a heart of gold is rescued from her terrible life by a generous man. In both movies, there is also a dose of Pygmalion thrown in as the woman transforms into a proper leading lady. Then, of course, there are the numerous films adopting the Taming of the Shrew storyline from Shakespeare, movies in which a woman with a very driven or a hard-ass personality is softened just the right amount to be palatable, thanks to the love of the right man, as happens in 10 Things I Hate About You and The Proposal. Giving up or changing a career to make a relationship work, or even for bettering oneself, isn't necessarily degrading or sexist. It's the fact that we don't see stories about men doing the same thing amid the repetition of stories about female sacrifice and improvement. That's the problem behind these fantasy choices. But what about the action and excitement? What about the fantasies in which women characters dare to tread on and undermine the false gender binary, demarcating heroism and protection firmly on the male side? It has often seemed that the more explosions, the bigger the fight between good and evil, and the more driven the woman, the more she can take care of herself, the less likely she was to enjoy the fruits of romance. I'm going to skip ahead to the next paragraph. As a viewer, I was left torn. I wanted the women to have it all, not to seem to be excluded if they dared to transgress traditional female gender roles. But I found myself presented with heroines who never did. Heroines who seemingly had to choose between heroic accomplishment and romance, and who made it more complicated to see these options as possible for other than the male identified. This representational either or is one more symptom of the so-called war between the sexes that continues to confound feminists about the roles romantic relationships play in our lives, and even the idea of romance itself. How are we to be dedicated to empowering ourselves and other, but also to find a real romantic connection if that interests us? In the introduction of To Be Real, Telling the Truth and Changing the Face of Feminism, Rebecca Walker, who's the daughter of Alice Walker, reflects on a similar confusion about being confronted with, quote, contradictions in her desires, interests, and relationships that she, quote, had no idea how to reconcile with her attempt to, quote, make sense of how to make feminist revolution. Walker's concerns reflect those of many young women from my so-called Generation X, who have been grappling with a feminist perspective that has influenced their lives, but doesn't always seem to fit their lives. One in which they feel their desires conflict with what they have learned about fighting patriarchy from earlier feminist generations. One of the contradictions Walker describes facing includes feeling that, quote, I would never be able to maintain my independence and artistic strength as a woman. She was conflicted by both her, quote, attraction to stable domestic partnership and her, quote, desire to start a business and pursue traditional individual power. I bought Walker's book around 1996. Actually, I'm going to skip this paragraph. Sorry about that. This problem, the reconciliation of feminist goals and activism with romance and its ties to narrow conceptions of womanhood, has been far from solved for feminists growing up in the 21st century, whether on screen or in real life. This problem is at the heart of my own yearnings and my attempts to find assurance and even decent blueprints in the unsatisfactory on-screen fantasies about the strong, independent woman. And it has long raised many questions for me, 3 of which are central to my investigation. Why, entering the 3rd decade of the 21st century, is it still somewhat rare to find portrayals of a complex, empowered woman in love who doesn't sacrifice her strength and independence to enable a successful romance narrative that doesn't reinforce traditional notions of gender that assert male domination and female subordination? What kind of romance would make this possible? And how would it complicate our understanding of heterosexual norms, gender identities, and women's agency? Would such a romance be considered feminist, or at least feminist friendly? Because there has been a lack, though, doesn't mean that such portrayals didn't or don't exist. There have been glimpses of alternative romance narratives, not only in niche genres or in programs with small but dedicated followings, but also in Hollywood blockbusters and primetime television that represent an empowered version of womanhood that still finds room for intimacy, even if it is a struggle. These alternative romance narratives offer sites of potential resistance, transformation, and agency. They show us examples where feminist-friendly heterosexual intimacies are being advanced and even celebrated, where pockets of popular culture are replacing the feminist man-hating stereotype with a feminist man-loving ideal, whether the love is romantic or not, that portrays female relationships with men in ways that avoid or question the old caricatures. My purpose with this study is to pick one such pocket of transformation, the fighting female romance narrative. The fighting female character is one version of the strong, independent woman. She differs from other versions, however, because her strength is represented visually as well as internally, exhibited when she uses her body and other weapons in combat. Moreover, fighting female narratives rely heavily on her exercising violence to protect herself and others. In other words, she poses a physical threat, maintains elements of self-reliance, and performs in ways most typically reserved for male heroes. Fighting female characters in a variety of genres and types have multiplied on screen over the last few decades. Yvonne Sims, Stephen Dunn, and Philippa Gates characterize the blaxploitation heroines of the early 1970s as the original fighting females on screen who, quote, not only paved the way for other action heroines, but redefined the ways in which women in general were represented in film by portraying a new character that could hold her own among men and women equally. And that was from Yvonne Sims. As these critics argue, the blaxploitation heroine was a crucial character who created the mold for the, quote, tough action women, as Philippa Gates calls it, of the last 40 years. They were the first American film versions and the first crime-fighting females to be full-fledged protagonists. Previously, women who killed on screen were relegated firmly to villain territory, like the unruly femme fatales of film noir and rampaging vixens in Russ Meyer B movies. I'm gonna skip ahead to page 16 here in that last paragraph. Through my analysis, I hope to provide a starting point for further exploration to what Bell Hooks calls, quote, a new ideological meeting ground for the sexes, a space for criticism, struggle, and transformation, and that shows readers there are already places within the overdetermined spaces of the mass media that are reframing relationships in ways that fit the kinds of feminist movement that Bell Hooks envisions, relationships in which, quote, the alienation, competition, and dehumanization that characterizes human interaction can be replaced with feelings of intimacy, mutuality, and camaraderie. Ultimately, my goal is to argue that some fighting female relationship narratives merit our attention because they reveal a new cache of plausible, empowered female identities that women negotiate through their intimacies and romances with men, however currently limiting they might be. These negotiations, in turn, enable innovative representations of male-female relationships that challenge long-standing cultural scripts about the nature of dominance and subordination in such relationships. Combining cultural analysis with close readings of key popular American film and television texts since the 1980s, my study asserts that certain fighting female relationship themes question regressive conventions in male-female intimacies and reveal potentially progressive ideologies regarding women's agency in mass culture. In essence, certain fighting female relationship narratives project feminist-friendly love fantasies that reassure audiences of the appeal of certain forms of empowered women, while also imagining egalitarian intimacies that might further empower women. So that's where I wanted to end for now. I thought that would set us up well, and I hope that wasn't too much torture.
No, loved it. Thank you so much.
Yep.
And at this time, I'm going to ask our panelists to ask questions of you related to your passion project. And we're going to start with Tiffany.
Yes, thank you, Allison, for sharing. That was really wonderful, especially for those who haven't maybe had a chance to read it yet. I did want to remind everyone who's on here that if you have a question, please use the Q&A feature and get that in there, and we will answer those after the panel kind of goes through a round of questions. So Allison, my first question for you, I really am intrigued by your creative process. You talked a little bit about, your inspiration, sort of behind what led you to do this research, stemming all the way back from childhood. But I kind of wanted to know more about how Love and the Fighting Female, as it is a finished product, how that came to life, and what inspired you to turn it into a book. And did you always know that it would be a book? So if you could just kind of talk about that, that'd be great for me.
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. So actually, when I started my PhD program in 2009, I was obsessed with Henry Miller. I had written my master's thesis on Henry Miller. I thought that I would continue to work on that in my doctoral dissertation. And then I took a fantastic class on intimacy in film. It was one of the first film classes that I had ever taken. But I have been a major watcher of films ever since I was young, and my parents got cable. We were probably one of the only people who had it, but it really shaped who I became because I watched so many movies and really loved it. And so in this class, I started to learn about intimacy studies, and then we had a final paper that we did, and it just made sense. Ever since 2009, I had been a little bit obsessed with the movie Mr. and Mrs. Smith, 2005, I think. I don't know if I said 2005, the one with Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie. Scott and I, we both loved it. We would just talk. We talked tons about it as we were leaving. We bought the movie and we would just watch it over and over. And it was just so much fun. And there was just something so interesting to me about it. And during that class, I was able to figure out, well, it was a really interesting representation of a kind of egalitarian intimacy. So like an equal partnership between the two of them. And so I explored that in this paper. And then by the time that I was done with the paper, I had a really great connection with my professor. She nominated it for an award that I won for the school. And I thought, maybe there's something to this. I kind of like writing about movies. And so I just plunged ahead. Luckily, I worked with Susan Bordeaux, who's a very well-known pop culture scholar, and she's the reason why I was at the University of Kentucky. She impressed me so much. And she was a fantastic mentor who let me do what I wanted and just let me grow the project. as I wanted. And so I just started watching a ton of shows that I had watched when I was younger and taking notes. And I knew that it was going to be my dissertation, and I always knew that I wanted my dissertation to be a book. And that just came because I finally went and talked to a publisher. I had the dissertation done, I had my manuscript, I had changed everything, and I found a really wonderful editor at McFarland who was really excited about my work. And so the creative process just came from my passion for movies, but really it was my passion for wanting to see some healthier, more equal relationships on screen and trying to figure out, were there any? Could I find any? And so those were two of my kind of central pushes for that creative process. Does that answer your question?
It does. Yes, thank you. And just as a, second to that, what was the writing process like? I mean, how long did it take to go, to get to where you are now, and how you kind of balance that with working and home life and just in general living through a pandemic?
Oh, yes. Well, luckily, most of the work was done before the pandemic. So I wrote the paper in 2011, and then took a year to develop my prospectus for my dissertation, which is where I watched a whole lot of shows and read basically everything I could about the topic, like everything that was in the University of Kentucky library that I could get. And it's one of the most well-endowed libraries. So it was a lot of reading. I wanted to be really conversant in intimacy studies and in romance and pop culture. And really, I started to notice that very few people were addressing this. So that helped encourage me. Then from 2013 until 2016 was when I was actually drafting each chapter, getting feedback from my dissertation director. And then when I graduated and moved here, I put the dissertation aside for a year. I wanted to get settled in my new job. And frankly, I was a little tired of it. I didn't want to see it anymore for a while. And I thought, I need a break. And I will say that I get a lot of crowdsourced enthusiasm. So I went to a conference where I was presenting on one of the ideas from one of my chapters. And the editor was like, they had the big editor room. And I just thought, I really should just go talk to some people and some editors. And that helped put me on my path. So from 2012 to 2016 is how long it took to write the manuscript. And then I would say I started working in about 2018 on the book itself. From 2018 until 2020 when it came out. I finished our final proofreadings April or May, or maybe June. Pandemic time. During the pandemic of the end of last year, and then it came out in July. And it's a very long process. I do want to write a second book, and I'm planning on 7 years will be a great timeline. I'll be happy with 10. But yeah, I need to be realistic. It takes a very long time. Mm-hmm. Oh, and mixing it with my home life, I wrote on weekends and I wrote on breaks. One of the things people don't always know about professors, and they think, oh, this is great, I get to have breaks and have summer off. No, we work all the time. If we're not working on our classes, we're working on our own projects that inform our classes. And that's really what gives me the enthusiasm. I love to help other people find their passions. And so that's why, part of the reason why I do what I do.
Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. I want to invite the audience to please start throwing your questions in the Q&A so we can start queuing those questions up for Dr. P. In the meantime, Rhonda, you have a question.
Absolutely, I do have questions. First of all, I wanted to thank you for the passion you've used in working with a library. The library doesn't magically have collections. It is suggested by professors and people are doing their different studies. So when we see Allison working on things, we have a really fine gender studies collection, primarily thanks to Dr. Palumbo. And additionally, she helped us get this year a beautiful database, not a lot of people have, from ProQuest, that has the archives of women's magazines. So you can see the ads, the context of the articles, and the whole thing. So if any of you are working in women's or gender studies, we have the database for you, thanks to Dr. Palumbo, who was very gracious. And again, she used her conference time. Somebody said, try this, and she brought it back to the library, and we did. And it is beautiful. It's rare to have the full color images available for research, and for community college, we're blessed to have it, and blessed to have somebody who encourages using it as research. Now, my question, I've been a librarian for about 20 years, and this is the question students have always asked me or belabored me with. It would be so much easier, they believe, if the materials were audio, and specifically if they were on video. Now, your book is full of film study, like film research down to the milliseconds. And you have reams and reams of bibliography material relating to that research. Tell us a little bit about the reality of researching with video and film.
Sure. And just for a quick aside, I prefer they. I use they instead of she. But yeah, this is a great question too, because yeah, I have a lot of students. I teach reading and writing, and you know, sometimes they would like, oh, I would love more video, and I respect that, but I don't think they always understand what that entails. So I probably watched over 1,000 hours of television. And I'm not kidding. I watched entire series because I needed to be completely conversant in understanding what happened in the beginning of that series and what happened in the end and how did it change. And so watching 1 hour could take 3 hours, especially if it was a really good episode, because I would have to pause. I would have to type down my notes. I would have to sometimes pause because I wanted to quote from it. And I'll tell you, when you're working in film and television without having transcripts or scripts, it is so much harder because you're pausing, typing, pausing. Wait, was that a the or an And then I have to go back and redo that. And so it's really about attention to detail. Whether you're listening to something, watching something, or reading something, you have to be paying super focused attention to be able to make critiques. Well, gosh, I remembered 3 episodes ago that one of the persons said the same kind of thing. Oh, I wonder if this is going to be a pattern throughout. And so then when I would watch future ones, and when I thought about past ones, I would think, okay, have I seen this elsewhere? And then I would have to cross genres. And so a lot of people said, gosh, it must have been really fun to research that. And as a long time film and TV binger, it was hard. I was doing 8 hours a day of watching TV, and it's pretty miserable because it's also a very lone activity as well. But I really love reading research more just because it's always on the page. I can see it right there and flipping back and forth. Wait, that was 2 pages ago, versus like rewind. Oh, wait, I went too far. Oh, I didn't go far enough. It was very frustrating. And, but ultimately I was always guided by my desire to get things right, to be thorough, to be fair, and to make it make sense with the argument that I was trying to build. And so keeping all of that in mind, whether I was listening, watching, or reading, really was a lot to juggle. Thank you for asking.
It's a great question. So my turn. So after reading your book, I began to look more critically at how fighting female heroes are portrayed. And I noticed a couple things. One is that often their fighting capabilities are legitimized by a man who is usually their love interest or becomes their love interest, or they are ultimately saved by a man who is usually their love interest. For example, both of these things happen in the movie Mulan. So Mulan, if you've seen that movie,
Yep.
okay.
I haven't seen the live action, but I've seen the cartoon.
Okay. So Milan saves the entire army. And after that happens, Milan's gender is discovered, and she is the commander of the military banishes her as her punishment. But a man with whom she has romantic tension, there's been this romantic tension building up, ultimately steps in and legitimizes her. And only because of that is she allowed to continue to fight alongside them, even though she has more than proven her capabilities. There's another recurring theme with fighting females that I've noticed is fighting females often are depicted in scenes relying on their sexual prowess, even though that fighting female has the skills to defend or defeat her enemies. And I'm thinking in this example of Black Widow in the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like these things distract from the plot. And I just want to get your perspective, since you have looked at this from many different angles.
Mm-hmm.
So could you comment on that?
Oh yeah, I love that. The objectification of the female body is by far one of the hardest obstacles for creating feminist-friendly media, because it's so deeply ingrained that women-identified people objectify other women-identified people. We constantly feel like we have to talk about women's bodies, and that women's bodies have to be scantily clad or be acting in some way that's somewhat sexual. And I read recently this really interesting, so if you ever want to get lost down a rabbit hole, talking to action fans, or rather reading what action fans write about realistic fighting scenes in movies. So there was this big conversation that I was reading about it's not a throw, but basically it's a thing where the fighting female launches herself up and somehow wraps her legs, so her crotch is in the guy's face, wraps her legs around him so that she can then like flip him over or break his neck. And all these people are like, that's just so unrealistic and unnecessary. Yes, it's possible, but there are much better ways to take somebody down. And if you start looking, you will, especially in, I would say, the last 10 years, this takedown has become very popular. And absolutely, this is a great example of how a narrative can undermine a representation of an empowered woman, because it is reminding us that she is an object to be valued primarily for her sexual attraction or her attractiveness. And who does that appeal to? Well, it's supposed to appeal to men, even though the world acts like there are no lesbians or other sexualities out there, often in prime time. Yeah, they're just like, hey, this is appealing. And that distraction is what is part of the problem. And so we see that in Mulan. It's another example where, you know, she's not a female prostitute. She's not what was the other example? She's not the Meg Ryan character, but she's more like the hard ass, the driven character who needs to have that love of the man who legitimizes it. Well, it's okay that she did these things because she's heterosexual and I care about her. And so now you can use my legitimacy in culture to give her legitimacy. And what's really confounding for me is that we do need partnerships with each other. Men and women and everyone in between, we all need partnerships with each other. And I don't mean just romantic, I mean intimate, I mean camaraderie, I mean friendships, sharing and closeness. But romance and sexual pleasure is also part of that as well for some people, depending. But that partnership often ends up just reinforcing the fact that it is the male who legitimizes. And I do write about that, especially in my chapter on fraught fighting females. One of the, I think they're kind of my favorite type of fighting female, outside of the superheroes, which is funny because I don't really do superheroes in my book. But the fraught fighting female, she always has like a father or a father figure, or she often does, who is like, I am giving you the legitimacy to be a violent woman and to transgress these roles. But then that's just really replicating male domination and female subordination. Yeah.
Gosh, thank you. You spoke right to the heart of what I'm seeing. Yes, thank you. Belinda has a question for you.
It was so great hearing you read. Thank you. I just love this book. And today I was looking through the places where I wrote in the margin and underlined, and man, it's just so rich with good stuff. So my question is about how you clearly show the connection between societal expectations and media influences, and the cycle that feeds how we see men, women, and their roles with each other. As we're evolving, the expectations are changing. And as you say on page 182, end quote, female power doesn't have to be developed at the cost of male power, end quote. So I'm encouraged to see our new Vice President, Kamala Harris, who shows us a real life, strong, independent woman with a spouse. So my question is, what do you see as the next step in the circle staircase of societal expectations and media influence? And who are some of your favorite characters providing us a peek into the future of satisfying, equitable relationships?
Love that. Yes. Ultimately, my goal was to not simply point out the problems, but also to point out the potentials. And a lot of the shows that I talk about are what we call problematic. I mean, there's the elements of, we see the strong, independent woman, she's doing her thing. But yeah, like in the examples that Dr. Sarah Thompson-Tweedy showed us, in Mulan and the Marvel franchise, it's still so common to be seeing all kinds of ways that women's power is being degraded. And then that just is supposed to rely on the men's power. But see, having that actually creates an imbalance that doesn't only harm women, it also harms men. And I'm talking about people who are having maybe traditional heterosexual romance connections, because they then have to try and play roles in their relationship that reflect that. And there's been a lot of studies that show how people are influenced in the way that they see romance on screen. And so where does that lead us? Well, I have been seeing some fantastic new television shows and films that are blowing some of the stuff that I wrote about out of the water. In the book, I would say probably my favorite of the narratives still has to be Mr. and Mrs. Smith, because the objectification of Angelina Jolie aside, not that that's a small issue, but the objectification of that, they really were parallel and partnered through so many aspects of that. And the way that the entire movie, from the dialogue to the action and to the plot, really kept them both on the forefront of that narrative, and was showing how they're both independent people who have their own needs and have to figure out a way to bring that together. And one of my favorite shows most recently that I think is a really great example of that is actually Black Lightning. So I have to return back to the superheroes. And quickly, the reason I didn't write about superheroes is because, as exciting as it is, I mean, I just rewatched Wonder Woman 1984 and I loved it. I mean, everyone else seemed to hate it. I loved it. I watched it again last night. It's just so much fun for me. And I do love those superheroes, but they're fantasies, and it's not something that everyone's going to see themselves as. Maybe, you know, like a police officer or a private detective or something, a real person who exists in the real world. But Black Lightning, gosh, the CW is killing it. Black Lightning, where we have an entire family of superheroes who are all negotiating their strength and independence and helping each other. And what I've really loved about it is that the father, who is Black Lightning and who was the superhero at the beginning of it, has had to learn, and we've watched him learn how to let other characters who are heroes find themselves and be themselves. And they're constantly resisting his power. And they're like, no, why would we do it your way? I've got my own way to do this. And they are forced to negotiate together. And I just love that, especially because it's a whole family. It's a father and a mother. The mother is not a superhero, but she's got like this amazing brain. And she is also very much her own person. And then they have two daughters who are superheroes. So another one that I really like on the CW is Supergirl. They introduced not only one of the first lesbian character romances, so like one of the first non-hetero related romances on small television for fighting females, but they also have the first, or had, I don't know if there are more now, I haven't watched much, but they had the first transgender fighting female on there as well. And I found that super exciting because I'm really just about getting beyond the scripts of these false gender binaries that really don't exist and that we reinforce for no other reason than habit and because we have no other way to envision it. And that's what I'm looking for, the narratives that will help us envision it. There's still very few and far between. Like the other day, well, actually it was a few months ago, I watched, was it The End of the World? I don't know, it was this thing, it was on Netflix and there were 4 little boys and then they were being super objectifying of a little girl. And it was just so disturbing to me. And I thought, I'm sorry, is this 2020? What's happening here? So there's this give and take. And it's a constant process of trying to push forward these representations that are more inclusive and more representative of the varieties of human romance and human sexuality. We get that, but then we get the traditional comfortable status quo that pushes back against it. And so I haven't seen a whole lot of narratives that do that outside of superheroes yet, because it's still, like, literally, our culture cannot really fathom it outside of some kind of fantasy, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
Oh yeah, that's so rich. I just love all the details. And I love how you point out that the roles that can keep women in boxes also keep men in boxes. And it's really a back and forth struggle. And as we all open up to more ideas and evolving forward, it can be freeing for all of us, not just women.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that we're all on a continuum. It's not a binary. It's like here to here all along the way. Yeah. Thank you so much. I've loved listening to you.
Yeah, awesome questions. And let's do some awesome questions from other people. I'm looking forward to seeing what we've got here.
Dr. Palumbo, I can go ahead and field some of those. I've been reading a couple to you. That way you can just kind of focus on getting those answered. So there's 2 questions that I'm going to combine because they seem sort of, you could talk to them at the same time. The question 1 is from Jennifer McCarthy. Did you examine any foreign films, i.e. La Femme Nikita, or did you focus on American titles? And Monica asked, from all the material that you did research, did you find that most of it was made or written by males or females?
The majority of the films and television shows that I talk about throughout were directed by, written by, and primarily had male production crew. That's a big part of Hollywood now. And one of the things I really like about all the streaming services is that they're poking a lot of holes into that, and Hollywood is starting to try and catch up with all of the new diverse voices. And I just lost my train of thought there. What was I saying? Sorry, yeah, my mind just went a little bit blank. Oh, yes. Okay. So the male production crews. Yes. But what's interesting is, for example, Remington Steele. Remington Steele is one of my all-time favorite TV shows, and it's from the 1980s, and it still holds up really well, which I was pleased about, because a lot of the shows that I rewatched, where I was like rewatching The Bionic Woman, which did not hold up well, and Scarecrow and Mrs. King, which I remember liking as a kid, but it also did not hold up well as an adult, because I was like, all she does is get in trouble and then he has to save her. Okay, this is getting annoying. But the Remington Steele, the person who basically created that, my brain is blanking also right now on his name, but he wanted to create a story of just a female private detective. And everyone's like, oh, no, that's not going to happen. You're going to have a dude in there. And you can kind of get a sense of that in the beginning. Like in the very first episode, they talk about chauvinism and sexism, and you really see that tension between the character who will become Remington Steele and Laura Holt, who is the professional female detective. You see that from the start, where there's like, okay, so he recognizes the problem here as a character, but he's still going to be playing that role where he's creating problems for her power. And so again, that, one step forward, two steps back. But yes, I wanted to focus mostly on American, but La Femme Nikita, oh gosh, the Nikita narratives. Where would we be without La Femme Nikita? So La Femme Nikita, for those of you who don't know, 1990, Luc Besson created a movie about basically this woman who is forced to become an assassin. And that storyline birthed an American remake, The Point of No Return, which with Bridget Fonda in 1993. It also led to a more recent version of Nikita, which was fabulous. 2013, it started on the CW, and then it went to Netflix, and they finished the series. And it's by far my favorite Nikita. The worst Nikita was the TV show from 1997 to 2001. And those were some of the longest watching hours of my life, because no one in the show has like any affect at all, ever. But anyway, so it just branches off. But then the show Alias also, and then Luc Besson's most recent movie, Anna. And then there's a movie with Jessica Chastain now, that's Ava. And then there's The Red Sparrow. Like, all of these are very tangentially related to the same topic of La Femme Nikita. So one of the things I write about is, why are we so obsessed with this storyline? And it's because it's such a good one in terms of trying to visually represent the tension for empowered women trying to claim their own autonomy and identity, but being stuck in these systems that are just bad for everyone. Now, granted, most of us don't have to worry about being killed if we get our role wrong, but still it's creating that tension and it's reflecting it, while at the same time it's reinforcing it in our viewing mind. So we keep seeing this over and over. But I'm trying to think of, there aren't a whole lot of foreign action films that I've watched, but I would say probably French films tend to be the closest, in my experience. French and British films and television tend to be the closest ones to what we see here in America in terms of representations. There's a lot of similarities in the conflicts for feminism and empowering women and creating equality in all three of those cultures. Great questions, thank you.
Great. So this next one, this comes from Daniela. Movies showcase many aspects of life. Heroines are constantly sexualized. This happens in real life too. No matter what a female does, it's for the male gaze. While this is very difficult, how do we stray away from the male gaze in film, pop culture, when society itself is still very heavily revolved around the male gaze?
Oh yeah, how do we get away from that male gaze? Well, Daniela, I want you to write that book next, because I know we're still going to be talking about this in 20, 30 years. Why? Because we've been talking about it for hundreds of years. I mean, Mary Wollstonecraft, in her The Vindication of the Rights of Women, was talking about the problem of just letting women grow up to be these pretty birds who are supposed to sing and be pretty and buy things and look good in those things, because it basically, her argument was that it destroys people's morality. I wouldn't quite go that far, but it definitely does destroy their sense of self-autonomy and their identity, and it makes them seek the approval and attention of others, not just men. It's like the women and the female body who have been subjected to these objectifications learn not to find their sense of self in themselves. They learn to find it from others. So how can we get past the male gaze? Well, one of the things that's really happening great, like I said, in streaming services, is that there are so many more female-bodied and or women-identified directors and writers who are telling stories about what it is to be women. A really great show that I'm into now, Nora from Queens. It's not action oriented at all, but I love Aquafina's character because she just hangs around all the time in dumpy t-shirts and jean shorts. Billie Eilish, wait, is that correct? Billie Eilish, the singer, is that how you pronounce it? Yeah, I love Billie's style because it's just all about comfort and self-expression in the way that she prefers to experience the world, and she's rejecting the male gaze. But I also don't think that we should have to shape ourselves to avoid the male gaze, because one, it's impossible. I mean, I've been called in sweatpants. You know, it's not about attraction. It's not about any value. It's really just about a power imbalance and one person thinking that they have the entitlement or the right to speak to another person about how they look and how they think about how they look. I don't care. You're a stranger. Why should I care? Oh, because I have a vagina and therefore I should not be able to be secure in how I see myself and not want this to be anything about anyone else. That was a little bit direct, but that's kind of how I see it. But yeah, getting female bodied and woman identified directors, writers, actors. I love Laverne Cox, who's really been challenging our expectations. And I've always been a huge fan of RuPaul because I love how RuPaul is the drag queen version of a human being. You know, and it's just the more that we see people like caricaturing and rejecting and showing different stories, the more we're going to get away from that. But pop culture moves slow and it's going to take us decades. We're making great progress, but it's going to take decades. And that was a very long answer to a great question, Daniela. Thank you.
Yeah, and Tom had a great question too that sort of, I think you could talk about or speak to that as well. You know, he says that he can see the parallels between movie and real life. You know, how do we go about changing the perceptions that drive film come from real life, and what drives this change? You know, film depiction or real life changes that make the film different?
Well, that is the same type of question as nurture and nature debate. It's always both. You can never say it's nature, just nature. You can never say it's just nurture. It is always both. They are always completely wrapped up together. And so what we see on the screen is going to encourage people to believe and keep seeing that and applying that to the people in their real life. And then the people they see in their real life, when they see a reflection on screen there, they make these connections. And so stereotypes are just, it's just this vicious circle. And really, it's about how you spend your money. Like that's the only way that we change Hollywood. And that is unfortunately a big way of how we can change, how we change consumerism. Like, for example, when I grew up, it was the 1970s and 80s, and there was a whole lot of emphasis on, children are just children, and It doesn't matter if it's a female body or a male body, just put them in some overalls and go throw them in some dirt, and, you know, free to be you and me, and all of that kind of, there was a lot of pushback against gender in a lot of aspects of toy culture, TV culture, cartoon culture, comic book culture. In the 70s and 80s, that's when you started to really see new comic book writers coming out and creating new stories, to try and be like, hey, these are the stories that haven't been shared yet. But it's really where you put your money. So when movies come out that are in the big theater, that are done by women directors, or that have women writers, I try to go like first, well, back when we could go to the theater, I would try to go to the opening weekend, because those numbers matter, because Hollywood executives see those numbers and then they say, okay, this will work or this won't work. And they love templates. Like, they love things that they can easily slide into a template. And gender, like, just horrible traditional male dominating, female subordinating gender roles are so easy and just so tried and true that they feel like their money is going to be protected, and you have to put your money elsewhere. That's how I see it.
Great, thanks. Are we still good on time? I just want to check in, make sure we have time for a couple more. We're getting some really great questions coming through. So this one's from Melissa. It's kind of a look at what's to come. Are you planning to look into other types of media through that same academic lens of intimacy studies?
Oh, yes, yes. So one of the things that's a real problem with my book is that almost all of the characters are white, they are woman identified, and they are heterosexual, and generally from some kind of, you know, middle class, comfortable class background. I believe that Maggie Q is one of the only actors of color I talk about until the end, where I do bring up Supergirl and Black Lightning as kind of the future. But that was because the era that I was working in was really limited. And what's really fascinating to me is that the fighting female started with a blaxploitation heroine. I mean, Pam Grier. Oh wow! I mean, talk about a goddess of film action, and then nothing for decades and decades. And only in the past few decades, like most recently, we've had films like Columbiana, and I'm talking about American-made, Hollywood-based films. We've got Columbiana with Zoe Saldana. I think that's who. Yeah, Zoe Saldana, who was also in Guardians of the Galaxy. And she was also in Star Trek. So we're starting to see these particular women of color, Black women, Asian, let's see, I'm trying to think. Oh, yes, Priyanka, I want to make sure I say it, Priyanka Chopra. She was in the TV show about Quantico, and she married a handsome brother. I don't know why I remember that, but I can't remember her name. But yes, and she was a fascinating character. Not a great TV show. I did watch it. It was interesting, but there are so many more narratives that have come out in the last 10 years, and that I know are coming out more, that I think I'm going to start something new. And so I am going to continue through this intimacy lens, because I want to talk about the way that there are white women ideals. So the strong, independent woman archetype, as we really envision it as a culture, has to be a white woman. Because goodness forbid, she should actually have other problems based on her identity, aside from the fact that she is a woman, that might hold her down, because that's a bummer, and that's hard to deal with. We don't want to see our superheroes having to deal with racism or, you know, other kinds of isms that hold them back. But now people are challenging that more. And so I have no idea where this is going to go, but I have like a huge list of shows I'm already starting to work my way through of, and I'm thinking, okay, what can I do for my sabbatical to get this next book started? But yes, I'm really excited. I love the intimacy lens, and I'll tell you one of the big reasons why. Not just because it was such a big impact on my own life, but I talk to my students, and when we talk about love in our classrooms, it is so very, very eye-opening to see how many young female-bodied and or woman-identified students we have who are like, I really do want to have a relationship, but I come from a culture or a family or a background that still sees things very traditionally and expects me to make all my choices around what my possible husband will make, or they don't even have room to imagine me as a queer person or something along those lines. And they're still really struggling with that. And love is supposed to be a boon to our lives. And I feel like in so many ways, it is constructed to hold us back. In our fantasies, it's constructed to hold us back and tie us to things that have nothing to do with loving another person who is a unique and beautiful human being and that you find and connect with in this universe. So it's really important to me. I love love, and I love it so much that I will poke all the holes in it that I can.
That's great. So you did talk a little bit before when you were answering Melinda's question as far as some of the recent characters that you've enjoyed. This question comes from Aaron and Kirby. They would love to hear your take on more recent fighting females. They mentioned the Wonder Woman reboot. And they also mentioned 11 from Stranger Things, or if there's any other that stand out to you from recent pop culture and what you love and or hate about that character.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, 11. Oh, 11 frustrated me so much but okay, strangely, as I was watching 11, I felt, well, yeah, I do feel like I've been transported back into 80s media. And look what they're doing to this person who was basically genderless and then has her gender constructed for her by a bunch of young boys because they cannot see anything past the physicality of her femaleness. And then, so for me, it wasn't so much the problem that 11 got a romance, it's that 11 had to get prettied up and dolled up. Oh, I hated the scene when they put her in that horrible wig and that little pink dress, and she was just so happy about how she looked. And I thought, okay, it begins again. That's what I want us to get back from. I don't want us to create nostalgia around that. I want us to reject it. And it really has, I love how people are like, well, Winona Ryder, the 80s mom. And I was like, yeah, the 80s mom who really doesn't do a whole lot. And it was so much more what the male-bodied characters around them were doing, and just that they were all involved in the story. I was very disappointed in that, and I felt like that was a step back. Whereas, so Wonder Woman's what's really interesting to me. Now, I have not read the reviews about 84 because I still have to process it. I'm still trying to figure out some of my thoughts before I go out and then start to find out what other people think. But I do know that the Wonder Woman history in general has been a little bit fraught, and it's because Wonder Woman has a love interest in Steve, and it's whether it's the comic book or whether it's the TV show, and the movies, and people see this as automatically being the thing that softens her. And I'm like, well, the thing that really was working against her in the first movie, Wonder Woman, the 2017 one, was how every 5 minutes people are like, oh, you're the most beautiful person. Oh my God, you're so beautiful. Yes, it's Gal Gadot. I mean, okay, we see what's going on here. We do not need a constant reminder of this. And I was actually kind of disappointed in that. But I felt like Wonder Woman 1984 somehow seemed freer, and it seemed to make fun of that a little bit more. And also, it did show her as a person yearning for her own intimacy. What's wrong with that? Superman, Batman, all of these male heroes who always had some kind of woman who was ready, willing, and waiting, whatever the story was. And poor Wonder Woman has to have her boyfriend killed. And that's somehow supposed to be what frees her to be stronger or to be herself. That's so problematic, because everything that I understand about humanity and society is that the more people we have on our side, the more people who support us and the more people we partner with, the better off we're going to be. And we see that in the original Wonder Woman movie, 2017. But it's all, again, almost entirely dudes, except for one sassy woman. But what I liked about 1984 was that you see how Kirsten Wiig's character has been somehow fractured because of her feeling of not being valued and attractive enough to other people, to the point where it turns her into a villain. And this is something that I've been really finding interesting lately, is the feminist retelling of villain stories like Maleficent. I loved Maleficent. I loved Alice in Wonderland, and how in these remakes, they're showing what happened to the woman to make her a villain. Snow White and the Huntsman is another one, and then the follow-up they had to that, where the woman who became the evil queen had basically experienced trauma in her life and had basically been told that you better be young and beautiful to get what you can from men. And so they're showing the negative side of femininity. People talk a lot about toxic masculinity. There's toxic femininity, but really it's toxic gender when you are employing a gender role that you have to use to manipulate another person, or that you have to use to survive. Both of those are critiquing that. And so those are some really interesting characters that I've been kind of noting, and I'm not sure where I'm going to go with that, but yeah.
Great, thank you. That was a wonderful answer. And thank you to everyone who's been submitting questions. They've been really great so far. I think this is clearly a topic that at least Dr. Palumbo and the rest of us that are intrigued can go on and on and on. So I just wanted to say thank you again to all of our attendees who have answered questions. I think we'll go ahead and wrap up the Q&A. I did want to remind attendees that they can still interact with Dr. Palumbo. They can talk about any sort of aspect from the book or any unanswered questions that we didn't get to. They are available on Twitter, and I'm going to link that Twitter account so you can kind of get on the convo there. And you can also, we urge you to, if you haven't, go ahead and pick up a copy of Love and the Fighting Female and read it for yourself. And I'm sure even months down the road, Dr. Palumbo will gladly yield some questions and discussion on that. And the library, the William C. Bonatti Library, for those who are on campus, they have 2 copies available. So if you wanted to check that out and start digging in, you're more than welcome to. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Sarah Thompson-Tweedy to go ahead and wrap things up for us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Palumbo. And again, we're so happy and so proud to have you in the Big Bend community. And just being part of this tonight just reinforces for me how wonderful Big Bend Community College is, because of the people who serve here. And so I just want to remind everyone that our next quarter, we are going to showcase Dr. Dennis Knepp, and as it relates to his expertise in philosophy and pop culture, that will be another one you won't want to miss. And beyond that, we invite you to submit your ideas for maybe you have a passion project that you'd like to share, or you know of a colleague who has one that if you would ask that person to share that with us, we would love to consider for the Passion Project Showcase. And with that, I think we can call it a night. And I just want to say again how wonderful this was. Thank you so much, Dr. P. The book is Love in the Fighting Female. It is available in our library. You can also order it. And I wish you all a wonderful, terrific night. And any words in closing, Dr. Palumbo?
I was looking at the Q&A and I wondered, oh, the Americans, the Americans is actually one of the most fantastic egalitarian, egalitarian heterosexual intimacy shows that I've seen. It's very hard to watch. It's very violent, but it is an amazing show. So I just wanted to highlight that. And I also see this question about the Me Too movement helping or hurting the effort to change the depiction of female personas. And I think that that was just one important piece of the changes that's been happening. But Gina Davis, the amazing Gina Davis, created the Gina Davis Institute that looks at gender representations, and they have an entire website. They have an entire entire business that is all about improving representations of the female bodied and women identified on screen. So we've got people who are working on this. And I think that the Me Too movement was an important catalyst in bringing more feminist awareness today. And that's what this is really all about, seeing that feminism is about understanding mutual empowerment and coordinated empowerment and partnership relationships between people, whether romantic or not. And so what I really encourage you to think about as you're going out and watching all of your favorite old shows, maybe with this new lens, is not to just discount them and say, oh, I can't love the things that I love. Because I love so many television shows and films and songs that may not quite reflect my preferred ideals, but are things that make me happy or make me dance or make me feel excited. And I think that there's a lot of value in that, especially during a pandemic. We need our entertainment, but really just keeping an eye open to the values that you are seeing projected on screen and the values that encourage people to help each other and work together. I think that those are the most important stories that we can get out there. And I encourage you to maybe go write your own, get it out there, become one of those new makers. I would love it. I'll buy your book. I'll watch your movie. Just make sure I know.
Gosh, thank you so much. We appreciate you. We celebrate your accomplishment, and thank you for sharing it with us tonight. We applaud you.
Thank you. Thank you all. This was really fantastic. And yeah, contact me. You can also email me on my Big Ben website if you had questions I didn't answer. And I can talk all day about this stuff.
And I want to thank everybody who attended tonight for our first inaugural Passion Project Showcase. Stay tuned in the future. We'll have more coming at you. Take care, everybody. Have a great night.
Bye.